Thank you so much. My name is François Hortalot-Magnier. I am the Dean of London Business School, and I am so happy that so many of you are here with us tonight. Thank you for coming. You know that, thank you. Yes, to all of you. At London Business School, we care deeply about having a profound impact on the way the world does business and on the way business impacts the world. We like to be a place where minds come alive and ideas connect and collide. And ideas connecting and colliding, that's what it is about tonight. It's about sharing questions and perspectives and gaining insights from one another. Tonight, we are hosted by the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. The Wheeler Institute was funded at London Business School by Tony and Maureen Wheeler. Tony and Maureen were very generous to help us create this institute. You know about them without knowing because you know about Lonely Planet. They were the founders of Lonely Planet. The institute itself is focused on identifying big challenges in the world and then deploying business to solve them. What that means is trying to understand where is it that we can bring not only insights, but also creates community of practice, community of learning, to make sure that whatever change is implemented, it's implemented at scale and in a way that has enduring impact. The Wheeler Institute, besides funding research and funding this learning, also dedicates funding to organizing events like tonight. Public events that are happening here on campus at LBS and then on the net as well, thanks to technology. Public events to help us think about big issues that are happening in the world around us that are relevant to our community. And so tonight, that's what we are going to enjoy together. I'm glad that we're going to be joined here on stage by one of our own professor of economics and academic director of the Wheeler Institute, Professor Elias Papaioannou. And then another professor of economics, coming from an institution well known to all of you, Sciences Po in Paris, Sergei Guriev, who is also the provost there at Sciences Po in Paris. And so please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
So thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all at this Wheeler Institute for Business and Development event. Most of you know the work of Sergei Guriev. I just want to point a couple of issues. Sergei, who currently is the provost of Sciences Po, is one of the world's most prolific and most impactful political economists. And I would say that the unique feature of Sergei's work is that he combines academic rigor, having done important applied empirical work, conceptualizing those empirical regularities with good theory, and at the same time having done policy work in his native country, Russia, for some time, through the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. So it's one of those, I would say, quite uncommon among academic economists who have taken this extra mile and try to have a profound impact in his country, and the Eastern Europe, I would say, more generally. What I particularly like about Sergei, who I'm very proud to coin as a friend, is that his book that he will discuss today, Spin Dictators, is actually based on academic research, and he has been among the very first to notice, as he will discuss in more detail, that contemporary authoritarian regimes are quite different than the old-style authoritarian regimes. My father used to demonstrate against Pinochet outside the American embassy in Greece. We used to protest when we were young, but now the new style of autocracy has taken a different kind of format. He was among the first to notice this observation, and he blends as I said before, his insights from Russia with other parallelisms that happen across the world. Lastly, let me say that not only I, but I would say also the London Business School community consider Sergei a good friend. He has appeared more than 5 or 6 times in the emerging market class, and I know that many students are here today, taking this extra time to be with us and giving us his unique insight about ongoing political and economic development. So, Sergei, the floor is to you. Thanks big time for being with us. Let me just stress the rules of the game. So we have asked Sergei to give a 20-minute introduction to his book. Then I will pose some questions on his book, also opening the floor, opening for questions to the floor, and then we will move to the ongoing tensions between Russia and Ukraine and political economy developments in Russia. So that's roughly speaking the plan. Thank you all for being with us, and Sergei, thanks big time.
Thank you very much, Elias, and thanks a lot for working with me on those rigorous empirical papers, which are especially successful, the papers that we wrote together. So we're very fortunate to have Elias as your professor, as one of the world's most prolific political economists. I would like indeed to talk to you about the book we wrote together with Daniel Treisman. At this point, I saw some book presentations. Authors usually say that this is the best book on politics in 2022 by Financial Times, by Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, New Yorker, and so on, which is true, but I didn't put that on the slide. So basically, this book is exactly about what Elias was saying. This book is about the changing face of tyranny in the 21st century. And to show you how the face has changed, I show you the appearance of the old-style dictators. And Elias mentioned Pinochet, but if you actually look at majority of dictators in the 20th century, they all try to project the image of force, of brutality, of oppression, of fear. And this is not how non-democratic leaders look today. So today we see leaders who are non-democratic leaders, yet they put on business suits, they travel to Davos, they give speeches in business schools, they talk to Western investors, they bring investment into their own countries, but yet they are non-democratic leaders. Their goal is not to give up power if they are voted out of the office. Their goal is to concentrate power, eliminate political competition, but do that without open repression. And that is indeed, like Elias said, is what we've been working together with Daniel Treisman on many occasions. We wrote a few papers together. This is a general audience book, so it's a book which does have a website which contains all the data. SpinDictators.com has all the data, code for replication, and so on. But this book is mostly a narrative of the general model, but also some individual stories. So we discuss the toolkit of those guys, we tell you their stories, and we show how they learn from each other. We also talk about why we think this model has emerged and what to do about this. So basically, the main difference between the old-style dictators and the new-style dictators is that the new-style dictators pretend to be Democrats. And some of them do that very successfully. Some of them, as Viktor Orban, for example, is a leader of a country which is a member of the European Union. And some political scientists, because of that, count him as a democratic leader. Now, one important thing is because these guys manage to control media, manage to manipulate information, if you actually look at the polls, sometimes you see that these guys are truly popular. And this is a phenomenon I'll talk about. Now, it's not to say that we eliminated all 20th century's dictators. Some of them are still there. And I'll talk about transformation of Putin from Putin 1.0 to Putin 2.0. I don't know, from Putin 4.0 to Putin 5.0. But in general, even without transformation of Putin or other leaders that transform themselves from spin dictator to fear dictator, we still have old-style regimes like North Korea or Syria. Now, I picked up a picture for you where all of those wear military or paramilitary uniform, and this is not a coincidence, to project image of fear. You want to send a message that you have the force at your disposal. Now, the one takeaway you want to learn from today's lecture is majority of today's dictatorships are not based on repression, or at least not on open repression, but on manipulation of information. And this manipulation wants to send a message that the leader is popular and competent. It's not a grand ideology that these people are associating themselves with. It's the message that we are maybe imperfect, but Democrats. We are maybe not fully competent, but sufficiently competent and definitely better than the alternative. So that's the idea this message is based on. And so the book documents the rise of this model, and as I said, talks about the toolkit these guys use, how they actually stay in power, how they form this image, and how this model came about. Now, this is one graph I want to show you. Since I only have 20 minutes, I won't talk too much about methodology of classifying regimes. But basically what we've done, we collected data on political prisoners around the world in the last several decades, on torture, on political killings, on censorship, on elections. And we classified regimes that we can call fear dictators and spin dictators. On some regimes, we were not able to find data. On some regimes, it was very unclear how to classify them. But in general, you see a very clear picture. If you take all non-democratic regimes around the world and look at them by decade at which they came to power, there is a very clear qualitative shift in the last few decades. Previously, fear dictatorships, dictatorships based on open repression, were the dominating model. And now, the dominating model, the majority of non-democratic regimes, are actually spin dictators. So let me quickly go through the differences in the toolkit. Basically, the main difference is deception versus fear. We show a lot of evidence on this. We show how the model based on large number of political killings, political prisoners, torture, has actually become obsolete. I'll tell you a bit later why. But in general, this is something that the data show very clearly. What is important, spin dictators sometimes use violence. Sometimes they need violence to silence their opponents. They also use money to bribe their opponents. But some opponents decline those cooptation offers. And therefore, you need to use targeted censorship or targeted repression. The difference is not that spin dictators dislike repression because they are nice people. They are usually not nice people. But what they do, they conceal evidence of repression. They deny their implication in putting political opponents in prison on political grounds. They deny their implication, their participation in political repression. Now, that means that they have to minimize repression, because if you kill 10,000 people, that will be noticed, usually. However, what is important is previously dictators were proud of killing people. Now they are concealing this evidence. And I'll show you this picture of one of the longest serving non-democratic leaders who began his tenure in the golden age of fear dictators, Colonel Gaddafi. And he stayed loyal to this model until the very end in 2011. But this is a famous quote where he said, those non-democratic leaders who conceal the evidence of eliminating political enemies, he said, we don't do this. If we execute somebody, we execute this person on television. To send a message, to terrify people. That's very clear. Now, this is a quote from Vladimir Putin around 2015 when opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was killed in front of the Kremlin by actually soldiers of police. He still said it's a provocation against me. I have nothing to do with that, and that's a provocation, and he would never accept that his own government was actually instrumenting this. Now, one other thing is spin dictators don't like to put people in jail on political grounds for long terms. They sometimes use shorter spells, and there is this famous story of Ilya Yashin, who tried to participate in an election in 2019. He was detained 5 times in a row on short spells for, again, non-political crimes and misdemeanors. And whenever he would re-emerge from the prison cell, he would be put in cell back. And then the other thing is when people talk about Putin being a great innovator of imprisoning Navalny for fraud rather than political activity, Putin was preceded by other non-violent dictators such as Erdogan, the Kurdish politician Nurettin Demirtas, the brother of the current Kurdish party leader, was detained not for being a Kurdish politician, but for faking medical certificate to avoid army service. So just quickly, I should say that these people all run elections. They all have multi-party systems. They manipulate the rules of the elections, and they try to manipulate it in a less overt, less open, less obvious way. And so if you look at the share of regimes that ban opposition candidates outright, it's actually less and less common. This share is coming down. If you look at regimes that impose media bias, eliminate opportunities for the opposition candidates to reach out to the public, that is becoming a tool of choice. Now, let me say that these people not just look different, they also talk differently. One of the things we've done, we collected the texts of their speeches, and we analyzed the contents of the speeches. And basically, we looked at them, and we look at fear dictators of the past and at democratic leaders. And basically, simple statistical analysis shows that the contents of modern dictator speeches is the same as the contents of democratic leader speeches, and significantly different from the fear dictators. Fear dictators talk about violence, enemies, fear. The democratic leaders and spin dictators talk about economy, unemployment, inflation, investment, and public goods provision. So they don't want to project fear. They want to blend into the crowd of democratic leaders. So once again, there is a whole toolkit of selective repression, concealed repression, censorship, allowing some opposition media, but making sure they cannot reach out to broad audience. In some cases, that means that owners of opposition media are co-opted or threatened. And what is very smart, this is what many people don't realize, you can censor information about censorship itself. So people who live in those societies may not realize how unfree their media is because the information about censorship is also censored. This recursive, smart recursive relationship can actually help to send a message, we live in a free country, and surveys actually show that in many spin dictatorships, people think that their media are freer than media in the West. The fear dictatorships would work in a very different way, banning opposition authors and also just burning books in the squares. Now, one other thing which matters a lot for this audience is the idea of this model is to benefit from globalization, benefit from cross-border investment and trade, benefit from international flows of ideas and technologies. And for that, these people are usually pretend to be, well, they pretend to be Democrats to be able to bring in foreign investment, bring in technology, bring in capital. And for that, they don't close the borders, and they do go to Davos. So this is actually a very different model. Now, let me say a few words about why we think the change has happened and what the West should do about this. So one of the things I would mention here, as an academic, I can tell you that sometimes we can back things by data. And what I've been talking about before this slide is based on our analysis of global data sets. What I'm going to talk about now is based more on speculation, hypothesis, but we are pretty certain that this is why the change is happening. But this is more of an educated guess rather than outcome of statistical research. So what we say is, in the last few decades, global economy has become more connected, and economic growth, prosperity, and therefore popularity and support for the regimes became easier if you actually allow trade with the West and exchange of technology and capital. So this is something which is not new. A lot of scholars, including American sociologist Lipset, about 60 years ago, said eventually modernization, which means the spread of education, growth of middle class, should result in democratization. We don't really support this conjecture. Instead, we actually say that modernization does not necessarily lead to democratization. Instead, modernization can transform the old style model into a new style model of dictatorship, because the new model is better suited, almost in a sense of Darwinian evolution. This new breed of dictators is better suited for the modern world without borders, with global media, much more transparent world where it's harder to torture people without the world noticing. And therefore, this model is actually a better fit for today's realities. So one of the things I would say is these regimes have an important challenge. Modern world is based on a different economic model than the world of 20th century. So the world actually needs to involve educated class. These dictators actually need to engage educated people, because modern economies grow based on knowledge, innovation, and competition. Stalin needed workers to be able to read and write, to work in the industrial factories. Today's dictators need people who can work in IT sector. They need a creative class. The problem with that is when you have too many people with tertiary education, with critical thinking, they start challenging your model. They start understanding what's going on. On this, we do have data. We show that even in those regimes, educated people are much better in understanding what's going on. And there is a divide between educated and non-educated people. And then the question is, how can you silence the educated people through co-opting them or selectively censoring them? And the more of them there are, the better for your economy and therefore popularity. But it's also becoming dangerous for your politics. Now, one of the things I would mention is eventually spin dictatorship faces this wall, faces this challenge. And some of the spin dictators, to keep their power, revert to the old model. And in the book, which we finished in May 2021, we documented some of those examples, in particular Venezuela. Venezuela used to be a spin dictatorship under Chavez. Today, it's a fear dictatorship under Maduro. But once the book came out, you know that Putin has also transformed the Russian regime from being a spin dictatorship to being a dictatorship based on fear. In the first week of the war, all independent media were closed. Facebook and Instagram were banned. They were actually announced extremist organizations like Taliban. For whatever reason, WhatsApp, which belongs to the same group of companies, was still allowed to function. But Putin also introduced open censorship, saying that if you call this war a war, you can go to jail for up to 15 years, and some people are in jail for opposing the war. So this is still a great challenge, because we believe that eventually, in today's world, economy based on closed borders and repression cannot prosper. And that means that eventually too many people will ask questions why we don't have our incomes rising. And eventually these economies will not be able to provide answers to these people. But as a temporary fix, we see that many of these regimes go back. Some just democratize. And if you want examples, more optimistic examples, Ecuador used to be a spin dictatorship. In 2017, it started the transition to democracy. Armenia was a spin dictatorship, which is now a democracy. And in that sense, we are still optimistic. There is another reason for optimism, which I'll mention later. But in general, even those examples where these people use this time machine to travel back to the last century should not scare you too much. Now, what should we do about this? Now, we say that we should not allow these people to close borders. We should engage with the educated class. We should engage with supporters of freedom, with the civil society in those countries, because the more people like that are in those countries, the more difficult for spin dictators to sustain their models. And on the other hand, we should remember that these regimes also want to undermine the West. And this is not a bug, but a feature of those regimes. These regimes are by definition hypocritical. They want to pretend to be democratic, but they're not. So these regimes usually are run on multiple sets of rules, and corruption is a norm rather than an exception in those regimes. And another norm is use of corrupt money to infiltrate the West, to undermine Western democratic institutions, and the West should be aware of that, and the West should stand up to those attempts. One other thing I would mention very quickly is international organizations. Once you pretend to be a Democrat, you claim your seat in the UN Human Rights Commission. Russia was excluded only recently. Some other regimes, just for the benefit of LBS, I will not mention, but some other regimes who are members of this commission are accused of torture and oppression, sometimes openly. EU has a member, Orban, whom I mentioned, who undermined and slowed down in introduction of sanctions against Russia this year. NATO has a member, Turkey, which fights very persistently against Sweden and Finland joining NATO. And Interpol, as we say in the book, is run by a person who, in France, is accused of torturing prisoners in his own country personally. So that happens. Now, let me conclude, since I'm exactly 20 minutes now, what I wanted to say today. Just one slide to take home. Basically, the main message of this research is that dictatorships have transformed themselves. Majority of non-democratic regimes today are based on deception, on manipulation of information, not on brutal force. That is based on the model which looks like a democratic model, but it's not. For those of you who have not studied political science, the distinction between democracy and non-democracy is that in democracies, like political scientists would say, leaders are chosen through free and fair elections, and autocracies are everything but. And so these are the regimes where elections are not free and fair, where opposition candidates are harassed. But on the other hand, the pretense of democracy is there. So we think that this model has emerged because it's better fit for today's world, and I'm happy to answer your questions about this. But eventually, we send an optimistic message that these regimes are facing the challenge. They need critical mass of higher educated people, of innovative people, but these people also challenge the model. And eventually, this regime find themselves cornered, that they don't have enough resources to allow these people to grow in size and importance within the society. On the other hand, they need these people to grow the economy and therefore remain popular. And in that sense, that is a message of optimism. But the main message I would like to say, if you are scared of dictators, remember that first, this model of dictatorships is less violent. And second, these people want to pretend to be Democrats because they know that democracy is more popular than open repression. And in that sense, that per se is a message of hope, that we think that if our enemies pretend to be like us, that means our model is better and they themselves know it. So let me stop here. Thank you.
So let me thank you, Sergei, for your on-time remarks. This is something I never achieve in class. It's reflected in my evaluation, by the way. So I know that we have also many friends watching us from Zoom, so please pose your questions. So I have just 3 questions to jumpstart the discussion of the book, and then I will stop them because I want to leave at least 20 minutes discussing Russia and Russia-Ukraine today. So my first question regards what you discussed in the end, which is about this metamorphosis that we observe sometimes of regimes from spin dictators, which are kind of more popular because of censorship, to more like old-style fear dictatorship. So a positive view of this would be that when a new style dictator is more spin, I don't fully realize it. Perhaps I'm happy because I don't understand what's happening with social media. But then when I see him or her becoming way more Pinochet style, perhaps it's much more likely to go out and protest. Do you see this happening? And could this be like a backdoor of those regimes losing legitimacy?
Absolutely, and I mentioned Armenia, where the regime tried to keep the facade of democracy and elections, and eventually the regime had to go because of mass protests. when people realized that this leader who was president for a while and then decided that they will move to parliamentary republic, and so he would become prime minister, people understood that he lied to them, took to the street and kicked him out. And this is rather a rule rather than an exception. And in that sense, we should remain optimistic. Now, social media that you mentioned plays a key role in this. Whatever we think about the role of social media in disseminating alternative facts, disinformation, in non-democratic countries, especially in those where traditional media are censored, social media plays a very, very important role. And this is why such leaders usually try somehow to censor social media, usually in a covert way. And this is a very important part of their model as well. But it's very hard to stop social media, and social media can help to inform people and mobilize people. And this is something, a lot of research that we discuss in the book about this.
So my second question is, you touched upon about remedies. So what can, for example, the civil society do? What can perhaps educated people? And actually, I would say that the fact that nowadays we live in a globalized world perhaps means that, some people, to pick Russia as an example, who potentially could be opposing the regime and the war in Ukraine, those are now, my understanding is that they can go via Istanbul, via Turkey, everywhere. So perhaps this stabilizes the regime rather than destabilizing them.
Well, these people are not international grandmasters in chess or professors of astrophysics, but they're very good in what they do. And they realized that if you close the borders, you accumulate a lot of unhappy people. And Putin himself has publicly said many times that when he's asked about brain drain, how Russian economy will do with all these smart people in London rather than in St. Petersburg, he would say, well, we're a free country, people can leave. And this is part of the model. He pushes out people, he prefers people to leave exactly for the reason you mentioned. Now, the role of civil society in those countries, and however many people leave, a lot of people stay, right? And the role of people who stay is to inform the others. And the job of the regime is to make sure that the people who understand what's going on, who see these regimes for what they are, cannot convince the rest of the population. And for that, these regimes invest so much in propaganda, in covert censorship, sometimes co-opting the civil society into submission. So this is the battleground. The main takeaway from this research is the battleground against those regimes is generally the information sphere. So social media, traditional media, conversations within apartments. And if you ask me what civil society should do, civil society should fight in this particular battleground, trying to convince the rest of the society, to make sure that these regimes don't enjoy even this pretense of popularity.
Thanks. So my second to last question would be, we are in a business school. So what are the implications for business of the rise of this type of regimes?
So this is an excellent question, and I saw some of you smiled when I mentioned Davos, but this is true. It's very hard to go to Davos and not see people like this. This is in many ways the quintessential feature of those regimes, to mingle with business leaders from the West that can bring jobs, technology, prosperity to those countries with which these dictators can enjoy image of competence and popularity. And so the Western leaders should always think about this issue of adversarial engagement. When they recruit people and educate people who can actually learn meritocratic practices and become, in a sense, new civil society, and therefore convince other people, create new competitive businesses. This is the positive side of the engagement. If you import corrupt practices from those countries back to London, that's actually something you should be watchful about. Again, remember, these regimes want to maintain a narrative that they are like the West. So they bring corrupt money to London or for that matter to Berlin, they bribe Western politicians or business people, or lawyers or lobbyists. And if this corruption remains quiet, they benefit from their co-opted colleagues to support them against sanctions, to promote their cooperation with the Western business. But if corruption comes out, they're also happy because they go back to their citizens and say, look, the West is also corrupt. And so I think it's very important to take the high road, and it's very important to remember their job is to undermine Western political democratic institutions. They benefit from every failure of the West, and they contribute to those failures. And so Western businesses should remember that reputation and success of business in the long run is based on taking the high road. And that's the best recipe for standing up to these regimes. It's not criminal to work in the right way in the wrong places. It's criminal to work in the wrong way wherever you are, including in London.
Thanks. So my last question, and I see also this is a question that Alexei asked, I had a similar kind of question, is you discuss in the book mostly about spin dictators, but this kind of paradigm to use social media, not necessarily for censorship, but to spread fake news or alternative facts, just because perhaps it's so successful there, perhaps find some people who try to copy it and amend it and use it in what is classified at least as democracies. So how can we think about, like, I don't know, spin democracies, or, perhaps, some people here who are very good in marketing at LBS students, can come up with a fancy name. But what are the implications of that for, let's say, the Western world, or what we will classify as a democracy? Because we do see the spread of misinformation.
That's correct. We talk about that in the book. So we talk about how this model actually emerged and developed, and we think that pioneer of this model was Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. And a lot of these leaders actually openly learned from Singapore, invited Lee Kuan Yew to give lectures in their parliaments and send their kids to Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. But I think Putin didn't learn from Lee Kuan Yew, and Putin didn't learn from Fujimori, who was yet another pioneer of the model. But Putin learned from Berlusconi, who is a leader of who was a leader of democratic country. And I think there are many leaders in democratic countries, many politicians in democratic countries who would love to become spin dictators. But sometimes democratic institutions withstand this pressure. So for the moment, neither Trump nor Berlusconi are political leaders running democratic countries. But that may change. Many spin dictatorships used to be democracies, subverted by leaders using those tools. So we should be really watchful about those risks. There are many leaders in democratic countries who want to become spin dictators. So far, some of them we managed to stand up to. Sometimes we fail.
Thanks. So I just want to open the floor for questions. My time frame that I have to keep very tightly is that we have 10 minutes for questions about this part. So keep your questions about Ukraine and Russia. So let's focus on this part, please. Briefly introduce yourselves and a short question, please. Please? Yes?
Hello, my name is Anna. I'm from the...
No, take the microphone.
Take the microphone.
Hello, is it working?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. My name is Anna. I'm from the Blavatnik School of Government, Oxford. So my question is, so for example, based on Russia, what was the primary reasons of the dictatorship? So what actually happened or didn't happen with civil society that led to the dictatorship? Thank you.
So many political leaders want to become dictators. And indeed, the question is, what is wrong with a society that allows them to subvert democratic institutions? And in case of Russia, I think part of that was turbulent epoch of 1990s, when a lot of people actually did not gain from market transition. Elias mentioned my work in the BRD. One of the things we did, we looked at the distributional effects of market transition to the market. And basically, in many post-communist countries, including Russia, the people who benefited from market reforms were a minority, and the nostalgia for giving control of the economy back to the strong leader was there. Bad luck contributed. Russia is an oil exporter. 1990s were a time of low oil prices. 2000s were the time of high oil prices. And this is where luck actually contributed to the rise of popularity of Putin's regime. This is the work my co-author Daniel Treisman has done. He's shown that popularity of Putin in the first 10 years in power was very high exactly because of economic performance, which was due to luck, which was due to reforms done in the beginning of Putin and before Putin. And this political capital allowed him to do what Trump has not been able to do. And in that sense, there are many factors that contributed, but Putin is not alone. So if you look at Turkey, Erdogan came to power in a democratic way, has been lucky, also successful in the first years, and then converted this early success into political capital that helped him to subvert democratic institutions. So stories like this are everywhere. You can tell a story like this about Chavez as well. So this is luck, this is skill, and sometimes failures of democratic leaders.
Please. Costa.
Hello. Kostas Matakos from King's College London. Sergei, thanks for the fascinating presentation. I want to go to more stormy waters and the sanctions. And
Costa, you are not allowed. We will discuss about sanctions.
There is no censorship.
I'm using like the Greek connection. So sanctions later, please.
All right.
But the gentleman behind you had a question.
Oh, thank you very much. Sayan Dorjiev, Gartner IT Consultancy. Sergei Maratovich, thank you very much for the presentation. What do you think is the place of democracy in the continuum of progress is? Is dictatorship something inferior to democracy? Is it something we're going to? Or are there just nations that are better ruled by dictators?
Right. So this is where Elias has done research on and has been followed by other researchers. Actually, if you ask this question, say, 20 years ago, we would say there is a simple fact that most developed countries are democracies. There are very few exceptions to the rule, rich oil monarchies and Singapore. And I should say that Singapore is moving in the right direction, but still is not a democracy. But then you would say there is a correlation. Maybe those developed countries, however different they are, Israel, Chile, South Korea, Japan, or Western Europe, maybe they're destined, maybe they're geographically or genetically predisposed to be democracies. And this is just a correlation. Now, in recent 20 years, 15 years, starting with Elias's own work, economists and political scientists have shown that transition to democracy improves economic welfare. This is a causal argument. And in particular, there is a paper by Asimoglu and co-authors 2019, which is called Democracy Does Cause Growth, which makes this argument. And I can talk very long for about how the mechanisms work. Why democracy contributes to economic prosperity. There are many reasons for this. But generally, democratic decision-making system is more agile, more open to criticism, and therefore better predisposed for improving itself. Less vulnerable to grand mistakes. Many of you are going to be leaders. Some of you already run organizations. I can tell you that the worst thing the leader can do is not to encourage constructive criticism. It's very hard to encourage criticism, constructive or not. You don't like people who criticize you, I can assure you. Right? I'm saying that for students because leaders who are in the room know that. And yet, that's hard. And this is where democracies do so well, when they criticize the imperfect leaders and replace them with better leaders. when they create competitive political and economic environments. And we see that personalistic regimes, and most of spin dictatorships are actually personalistic regimes, make catastrophic mistakes exactly because there is no corrective mechanism. Now, there are some things, and we discuss it in the book, which may scare you and may say that my answer is wrong because we enter in the new era of artificial intelligence where big data are important to improve productivity. And we in Europe believe in privacy. We don't give the mass of big data about everybody to private companies and to repressive ministries. Well, China does. And there is research again on the symbiosis between repressive regime in China and private sector AI companies in China, where AI companies produce face recognition software and walk recognition software and talk recognition software that helps to repress the dissidents. Well, Chinese government pays back with masses of data which help AI companies to train their algorithm, improve their efficiency, and then make profits in private sector applications. So this symbiosis is something which should scare you. It scares me. But we also see how Chinese leadership makes mistakes, and China is not alone in this. Actually, my co-author has written a paper called Democratization by Mistake, where he shows that it's, again, not a bug, but a feature of non-democratic regimes to make mistakes. And this is what drives many democratizations. From 1/3 to 1/2 democratizations were due to mistakes of the non-democratic leaders. But let me finish on just one observation. If you think that certain nations are predisposed to be non-democracies, I would call it a racist argument. And that's exactly what I think. Whenever an American colleague says, well, this country has never had democracy. Well, a lot of countries have not been democracies before they became democracies. This country was not a democracy 1,000 years ago, right? And if you use strict definition, 200 years ago. And so in that sense, this is progress that we observe. Democratizations don't happen in linear way. There are backlashes. There are waves. We've had 3 waves of democratizations. We will probably have the 4th one. But whenever you think about those issues, remember that there was a South and North Korea, which had the same genetic and cultural heritage, and then they parted ways. And you know the difference in level of income now is several tens of times, probably 100 times. And in that sense, that tells you that it's not the genes, it's not the culture. Culture can change. And in that sense, we shouldn't despair that certain nations will never be democracies. Maybe they will be democracies after we pass away, but this is a long process.
Let's take 2 more questions on this part, please. You had a question? Ah, sorry. I thought you had a question. Yes, please.
Thank you. Hi, Carolina. I'm just a curious member of the public. I wanted to probe a bit your suggestion that these spin dictatorships do not have an ideology, mainly because I find that quite a problematic idea, because if something doesn't have an ideology, how can you fight against it? If something doesn't stand for anything, then what is the counter argument to nothing? So I guess my suggestion would be perhaps these regimes do have an ideology which is the same as our ideology, which is capitalism. And the difference is that they don't believe that democracy is a necessary contributing factor to capitalism. So I suppose my question would be, what do you think about that idea? And also, what is your optimistic take, because you seem optimistic in your conclusion, that if these regimes don't have an ideology, we can still somehow overthrow them?
Thanks. It's an excellent question. You're a young person, so you don't remember what ideology was. Ideology, it's a meeting like this where I would actually try to brainwash you into believing in Marxism. That would be an ideology. The 2 grand ideologies of 20th century were Marxism and Nazism, right? This is an ideology. If you just say that, I mean, homophobia is not an ideology, right? I don't know. To me, relative to Marxism is not really an ideology. Conservative views anti-European statements. This is really not a major ideology. Ideology is something that people are brainwashed to die for. This is the ideology. Capitalism is also not an ideology. Is a system where private property is allowed, right? And state property is also allowed in modern capitalist countries. And capitalist countries are extremely different. I live in France, which to many people coming from Soviet Union would look like a socialist country. It's still a capitalist country, but the share of the state in GDP is about 50%, right? So the state is a more important economic player than the private sector. And so it's, what is the French ideology? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Who's against liberté in England, right? Maybe Brexit is driven by the lack of acceptance of liberté, but this is not what Brexiteers have said, right? So I don't see this argument. On the argument that we cannot fight them because we don't know what they represent and they pretend to be us, this is indeed a complicated question. We should not take them for what they say. We should show what they do. If they do put people in jail based on political activity, these people are political prisoners. If they do practice censorship, we should call them censored societies. If they don't allow free and fair elections, we should call them dictators. And this is exactly how we fight them, even if they say we are a free democratic country. And this is, I think, is very, very important. And this is why social science is so important. This is why doing research on those issues is important. We need to expose what they are, not what they say. And what they say is exactly what we say. You're right. Because and this is what the data show. They speak the same language, but they do different things.
Please, last question from the gentleman, and then we move to Russia.
We've got one question over here.
Please, sir.
Yeah, hi, I'm Maxim. I'm not sure if it's working, but whatever.
Try again.
Try again. Yes, it's still working.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
working. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Maxim. I'm a student here at LBS. Elias actually knows me because I'm taking the emerging markets class. My question is as follows. So you mentioned that one feature of Spin Dictators is that they are using censorship to manipulate the media, and to basically give information to people that they think people should be given. But then, how is it different from what the US is doing and the Biden's Ministry of Truth, and the fact that they were basically lying, and Victoria Nuland has actually admitted they were in front of the Supreme Court? Like, different stories. The one that comes immediately to mind is Biden's laptop, obviously. But then, how is that different? Because I agree on the fact that there is some censorship and media manipulation in what you call spin dictatorship, but how is what the US has been doing under Biden different? Thank you.
So I'm not familiar with many stories like this, and I'm not familiar in detail with Hunter Biden's laptop story. I think the difference is you can go to Supreme Court and challenge them, and Supreme Court is not full of Biden's. It doesn't have majority of Biden's supporters, and will not for a while, and you can win this case, and you know about this, and you can talk about this. And you will not end up in jail on political and non-political counts if you talk about this. And so this is the difference. Political scientists believe that US is a democracy. Opposition can win. I would just mention to you that whatever Biden was doing, he did not win majority in the last midterm election. Spin dictators don't lose. And in the US, as I said, many people would love to become spin dictators, but so far they lose. But in general, I'm not ready to discuss specific cases from US politics. I'm really a scholar of non-democratic regimes.
Last question on this part.
First of all, thank you. I wanted to mention, usually when we explore dictators or we look what they do, we just focus on them. My question is, we shouldn't see what West has done to help them or take them to that stage. For example, the China that we know today, is it the result of China or what we have done in the West?
That's a great question, and I think the West has made many mistakes. Some of the things I didn't mention, I think the West became too complacent after the end of history. after the end of the Cold War. The West thought that the history has ended and there'll be no challenges to liberal democracy, and thought the game is over. And indeed was not watchful enough, and this is what we talk about in the book. There is a sentence which I would quote, which I would honestly acknowledge that was genius of my co-author, who said, as the East has become more like the West also became a bit more like the East. The business investment which went to the East and transformed the East, in many ways creating functioning high-income economies and democracies in the Central Europe, for example. But also some of the corruption and non-democratic practices went back from the East to the West. And in that sense, the West should be watchful. And as I said, should always be aware that some of these mistakes may have long-term implications. You mentioned China. The theory was that engagement would transform China, but we just failed, and engagement is not easy. We may see China democratizing, but probably not this year.
So let me now move to the second part and focusing on Russia. So Sergei, actually my first question is what Kostas Matakos from Kings was about to ask on sanctions. But before you discuss about sanctions, why don't you take 2 minutes to give us an overview of the Russian economy, either when we had the invasion in Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, or in 2019. Sergei, when he comes to the emerging markets, which is a much more academic kind of talk, you have this, I still remember vividly this slide that at some point, going to your point, that Russia privatizes. So you show like the significant decline of state ownership. And then over time, you have like all these big firms that are in principle private, but not exactly. So why don't you give us a bit an overview of how the Russian economy was either in 2014 or 19, and then, talking about sanctions, what do you think has been the impact so far of the sanctions, especially because, going to some of the questions, some Western politicians, for example, Marine Le Pen, would say, oh, look, the West is suffering more from the sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, and perhaps we should relax or totally remove them.
Thank you, Elias, and thank you, Kostas. Sorry for not being able to ask this question. In the class on emerging markets, I usually give a short 2 hours introduction to Russian economy over the last 100 years. And today I will not do that. If you want me to discuss the evolution of political economy of Russian regime, there is all these forces I was talking about. This was actually an inspiration for us, and it was 2014 when we saw the transformation of Russian regime with annexation of Crimea. This is when we started to work on this book, on this research agenda. And many things we learned about Spin Dictators were inspired by our observations from Putin. But in a very short summary, Russian economy was stagnating already for about 10 years. So basically, the growth model that Putin had in his first 10 years in power has exhausted itself. Corruption, centralization of power, non-democratic practices destroyed growth. And GDP growth came down from 7% a year in the first 10 years of Putin's regime to 1% a year in 2013. That is evidence to the need for a new model. So Putin decided not to reform, but instead to play the imperial card, and he did it quite successfully. But over time, the excitement about annexation of Crimea was coming down, and Putin needed a new card to play. And his calculation, a tragically mistaken calculation, was he can replay 2014, get a popularity boost if he does another war against Ukraine, captures Kyiv in a few days, replaces government in Kyiv, annexes east of Ukraine. That would boost his popularity again. So he made a mistake because he didn't have enough feedback. Again, this is a lesson for every potential CEO in the room. Encourage feedback. Encourage people who don't like you. Encourage people who challenge your views. Because otherwise, well, I hope you don't invade neighboring countries, but otherwise you can make tragic mistakes. Now, seriously, Putin underestimated Ukrainians. Putin underestimated the unity and resolve of the West, and Putin overestimated his own army. He gave a lot of money to the army, this money ended up in London and Zurich, because people who stole them thought that this spending will never be challenged, they will never be put to the test, right? Because they didn't realize that Putin will actually start this war. So nobody would expect that Putin will ask them how strong the army is. That, of course, resulted in this mistake. And I think this is truly a mistake for Putin himself. This life of Putin's, political life of Putin is shorter now than a year ago. Now, what happened to economy? As I said, stagnation was there already, but Russian economy was on recovery from pandemic, so it was projected to grow at 3% per year. Now, if you think about the oil prices in 2022, oil prices were much higher than expected, and with this oil price, Putin's economy should have grown not 3%, but more like 5% per year. Instead, we observed the decline of 3% per year. Now, that is a big gap between +3 and -3, or +5 and -3. This is much smaller decline than projected in March or April by Putin's government as well. So in March, people said Russian GDP will go down by 10%. Some people even said 15%. That didn't happen. There are several explanations for this. First, great uncertainty in March. Why? Because the West introduced sanctions that have never been tested before. Russia had 3rd or 4th international reserves in the world. Central Bank of Russia was sanctioned. Never before that was done, and never before it was done so quickly. And Russian Central Bank didn't expect that. And so panic followed, and a lot of people thought Russian economy is finished. That didn't happen. And so these unrealistic expectations were just too optimistic. Now, on the other hand, -3% is substantial. Also, this decline will continue next year. Russian economy continues to be in recession. And also, when you look at GDP, you shouldn't forget that during the war, GDP may be misleading. If you know your macroeconomics, you know that GDP of government consumption is evaluated in terms of dollars of government spending. If I buy $1 billion worth of munitions, this is $1 billion addition to GDP. And so in that sense, we shouldn't be surprised that when Russian military plants are working 24x7 right now, the GDP didn't fall as much as it could. If you look at other measures like decline in imports, decline in various non-oil taxes, decline in retail trade, we are talking about 10% decline year on year. And that is much more significant, of course. And in that sense, probably Russian economy was hit, but as people in London usually tell me, well, economists say that Brexit also undermined our economy by 5 to 8%, right? So, and we still are okay. Sometimes people say we are not okay. But in general, the problem in Russia is that Russia is now facing real sanctions, that sanctions against Russian oil and gas just started, and they had a major impact on Russian budget. So just to give you a number, this is an unprecedented number. Probably Putin will do something about this. But in December alone, after oil embargo and oil price cap were finally introduced, Russian budget deficit was 4 trillion rubles, which is 2.5% of annual GDP. So the deficit in 1 month is 2.5% of annual GDP. Russia is selling oil at $25 to $30 per barrel discount to global oil price. Why? Because the West finally introduced full embargo in the West and oil price cap for the rest of the world. So sanctions limit Putin's ability to finance this war, and this is the most important impact. Will the sanctions stop the war? That depends on how you define the end of the war. And I think whatever we say, every additional $100 billion we give to Putin is additional $100 billion that Putin can spend on killing Ukrainians. And if we can limit the amount of money Putin has, we save lives. And this is very unfortunate that real sanctions only started in December. Remember, Putin's currency reserves were frozen on the 3rd day of the war. Officially, government of Russia says we got $300 billion frozen. The trade surplus in 2022 of Russia was 250 billion. This is unprecedented. Putin got this money back by selling oil to Western countries during 2022 because real sanctions only started in December. And gas sanctions have never been introduced. A lot of people say gas is very expensive, this is because of sanctions. No, the West has never sanctioned Russian gas. Putin himself stopped exporting sanctions to the West in summer.
So let's take more questions. We have 10 minutes. Please. Actually, I need to turn to the left. So
thank you, Sergei Phil. Thank you, Sergei, for the lecture. Let me give you probably next phase for the second for your second book. So I want to ask you about the person who is heavily discussed today, Mr. Zelensky. So after winning more than 70% of votes in Ukraine in the last elections, even before the war, he started to put, there's rumors that he started to put the pressure on his political opponents, political parties. Now in the war we can see that he's closing medias and newspapers, and also put pressure on local church and priests. So what are your personal thoughts about him? Thanks.
As a Russian citizen, I'm not able emotional to discuss this. I just can't criticize President Zelensky right now. I think this is not right moment to discuss those issues. If you're a Ukrainian citizen, you want to criticize your president, that's your right. I think as a citizen of the country that invaded Ukraine, I just can't criticize Ukrainian politics.
More questions, please. There was a question up there. I need to also get questions from the left.
Well, let me add one thing that whatever you think about President Zelensky, he personally showed an example of courage. Some people didn't expect that from him, but he personally contributed to the different course of the war, simply staying in Kiev. And this is real personal courage because he was told that Putin is very likely to capture Kiev and arrest or kill him. And Putin himself would not have stayed in Kiev. And many of democratic or non-democratic leaders would leave, and Zelensky didn't, at a great personal risk. And at least this deserves a lot of respect.
Please.
Thank you. My name is Khlyb. Actually, I am Ukrainian. I could answer the previous question about church, and I should say you are very misinformed, but sorry, this question wasn't for me. So, Sergei Maratovich, my question would be please about, in your opinion, is Ukraine still really a democratic state with a lot of problems with corruption, not really properly working courts, etc., and does it have real chances to survive as democracy and prosperous democracy? Thank you.
Thank you. Ukraine is not a liberal democracy in the sense that the Western democracies are. There are many, as you rightly said, problems with checks and balances, separation of powers. And a lot of political scientists would say that Ukraine is an imperfect democracy, but in the last several elections, opposition candidate won. So in that particular sense, there is a sign that there are healthy democratic institutions which are at work. And I think right now with the roadmap to joining EU, I think Ukraine has a great opportunity to become a liberal, democratic, and prosperous country. When does it happen? How does it happen? How much time it takes is a good question. And I think one big difference is, if you asked me a year ago, before the war, when Ukraine gets EU candidate status, I would not be able to predict that it would happen the same year.
Please.
Good evening. My name is Anupinder. I'm from the Sloan 23 class. I come from a military background, and my question relates to geopolitics. Over the course of history, world has used various solutions to geopolitical crises, At some point of time, it was war. At some point of time, it was international organizations. We graduated to military alliances like the NATO. And at one point of time, people believed that probably sanctions would be the go-to solution for crisis. While you've amplified that real sanctions have only started in December, they've still not sanctioned gas. Some people in the room might believe that even sanctions are not the real solution today. My question is, are we looking at a strategic reset in the geopolitical domain? And if so, what is strategy going to look like going ahead from here? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not a military expert, and as an economist, I know that we should stick to our relative comparative advantages, right? So I will not talk about military solutions. Regarding sanctions, we know that the West does not want to go to war. And if you don't want to go to war, sanctions is the only tool which remains. Now, do sanctions work? That depends on what the goal of the sanctions is. Remember, Iranian sanctions were not introduced to change the regime in Iran, but to change behavior of regime in Iran and to sign an Iranian deal. This deal was signed several years later, right? And in that sense, those sanctions achieved their goal. In 2014, the West introduced sanctions against Russia to make sure that the war is at least frozen, and that indeed happened. Minsk agreements were signed. Whatever we think about Minsk agreements, the number of fatalities after 2015 went down dramatically. Each life lost is a tragedy, yet those sanctions which were introduced in 2014, especially in August and September, played a major role regarding this. Now, will there be a reset? Probably it will be. Is NATO obsolete? Probably not. Mr. Putin is afraid of fighting NATO, right? We see that. And whenever people say, well, NATO is a bad idea because expansion of NATO provoked Putin, we see that countries that wanted to join NATO and did join NATO are not invaded by Russia. Countries which did not, however, have either open aggression invasion or Russian military stationed there on a friendly basis, right? And you know that Czech President Václav Havel famously said, the problem with Russia is Russia doesn't know where it begins and where it ends. And today, the problem is that it's literally true. Because the border of Russia in what is internationally recognized as Ukraine, even Russia itself cannot tell you where the border of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Lugansk regions are, which part of those regions are part of Russia and not. And so in that sense, reset is needed. But what kind of reset we'll see, it depends on the outcome of the war. And I think it's the right analogy to compare this war to 1945, after which the modern system was created.
Let me actually, I checked my notes and I had a follow-up question to yours and to Kostas's about sanctions. So at least some people in the Western world thought that sanctions would lead to some decline in the popularity of President Putin, and perhaps there would be some regime change, not necessarily big. And I know actually Sergei has worked with those data on opinion polls for research in Russia. So can you tell us a bit what's happening with public opinion and whether this has had any effect?
So the short response to this question is, when you're in a spin dictatorship, you can work with this data. And there are biases. Some people are afraid to say they don't support President Putin. There are ways to identify those biases. And we talk about various methodologies which help you to measure those things. In fear dictatorships, it's pretty much impossible. So think about running a poll in North Korea. Well, Russia is not yet in North Korea, but still, in Soviet Union. Think about running a poll in Soviet Union. People are afraid. There are certain ways to interpret some answers, and we see now that war is becoming increasingly unpopular. To what extent it's an outcome of the war itself or mobilization that Putin launched is a different question. But actually, if you look at the director of a government poll agency, he said 2/3 of Russians want to finish the war. That may mean that he sends a message that it's time to nuke neighboring countries. So the war is over. But probably it means that Russians don't like that their husbands, brothers are mobilized. Now, is mobilization an implication of sanctions? The answer is yes. So Putin, in the beginning of the war, said, we don't need to mobilize soldiers. We don't need to draft anybody. We will pay people. And people voluntarily, with an important salary, would go to war. And that's been the case until September. And at that point, Putin understood he doesn't have enough money. And that is, of course, implication of the sanctions. The limitation of resources, depriving Putin of resources, was a major goal of the sanctions. And then it drove Putin to carry out mobilization, which resulted in growing unpopularity. Is it sufficient to change the regime? Well, again, we saw that Soviet Union was very persistent. We see how Maduro's Venezuela has been in place for 10 years, despite the decline of GDP by factor of 4, despite 20% of population leaving the country. All of that really tells you that some regimes, based on fear, can be more durable, unfortunately, than we think. But the goal of the sanctions, which is minimize Putin's ability to kill Ukrainians, this goal is being achieved. And if we didn't have sanctions, then Putin would continue to hire hundreds of thousands of soldiers without actually traumatizing Russians, saying only people who want to go to Ukraine will be paid 10 times average income and go to Ukraine, and that's fine. And he would remain more popular than he is now. So sanctions matter, and measuring the impact of sanctions is very hard. But if we see that Putin is not winning this war, part of that is also because he doesn't have unlimited amount of money.
So let me retain the privilege of the last question, since we're running out of time. So typically I start every course with a quote from John Kenneth Galbraith that the only reason why economic forecasting exists is to make astrology look very scientific. I keep saying this to Lucrezia, who is in the forecasting business. But since I will ask you not an economic forecast, perhaps you can say, so where do you see this ending happening? Especially looking on destabilization of Russia, perhaps thanks to the sanctions.
So I think this is a hot war. This is a hot war, and it will be ended on the battlefield. And much depends on what military experts can say, and I'm not a military expert. Much depends on the resolve of the West to provide weapons to Ukraine. Ukrainians say, if you give us so many tanks, then we will just get back our territory. This is a plausible scenario. And in this scenario, Putin will be extremely unpopular within Russia. He will be attacked not just by people who support Europe, but also people who support imperial ambitions, because Putin loses the war and comes back without victory, but with a destroyed economy. So this is an outcome that would be very bad for Putin, but he may still be in power for a reasonably long time, as Maduro is. However, much shorter time than otherwise. Another outcome is Ukraine doesn't get enough weapons, or Putin has more soldiers than we expect, or more Iranian drones, or more munitions from North Korea. Actually, the very fact that he buys Iranian drones, which are not top technology existing in the world, that he buys stuff from North Korea, shows that sanctions work, that whatever he says, once again, we economists judge people by what they do. The fact that he needs to buy equipment from Iran suggests that sanctions limit his capacity to produce top-notch military equipment. But anyway, coming back to the possible outcome, there is another outcome, which is there is a front line which is frozen. Neither side can progress. And that reminds us of North Korea. Talking to geopoliticians, you know that North Korea and South Korea have never signed a peace agreement. The war is still going on. And we may actually end up with an outcome like this. Does this mean that the war is over? Formally, no. Factually, de facto, a bit like the war before 2022. Putin will be much weaker than before 2022, but he may still stay in power after that. And then the critical thing is if Ukrainians get enough air defense to start reconstruction. Putin's goal is to continue bombing Ukrainian infrastructure. But if Ukrainians get enough Patriots or whatever technology is, they can start rebuilding the country. And Russia will remain under sanctions, being somewhere in between Iran and North Korea.
Thank you. So we have run out of time. On behalf of the Wheeler Institute, let me thank you all for coming. Also those who joined online. It was fantastic to, as Francois mentioned, to see you all here, such packed, and we have more people outside. Sergei, thanks a lot for taking the time and being with us. We will bug you again to come. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.